There is a sound the galaxy makes when it is about to change. It is not an explosion, not a war drum, not the scream of engines burning through atmosphere at angles that should crack a hull in half. It is quieter than all of that. It is a distress call, 3 minutes and 47 seconds of broken audio, corrupted telemetry, and one alien voice saying something that no translation matrix could fully decode. Not because the words were complex, but because the emotion underneath them was too raw, too desperate, and too familiar for any machine to process cleanly. The Veilithi had been transmitting for 6 hours before anyone heard it. The Galactic Cooperative heard it first. They flagged it, filed it, routed it through 17 committees for subcouncils and one emergency arbitration panel that decided, after 9 hours of deliberation, that a response force could be assembled within 4 to 6 standard months, pending budget approval and a full threat assessment review. Earth heard it 40 minutes after the Veilithi started screaming. By the time the cooperative finished their first committee meeting, humanity had already launched. This is that story, not the story of why humans are dangerous. The galaxy already knows that. Every species with working sensors and a functioning fear response knows what Earth is. A gravity well that should not produce complex life. A radiation bath that should have sterilized the surface a dozen times over. A biosphere that never once, in 4 billion years, decided to be gentle. The creatures that crawled out of that place were not built for peace. They were built for survival. And they had survived everything their own world could throw at them, which meant they had been training for war since before they had words for it. No, the galaxy knows what humans are. This is the story of what humans do when someone calls for help. This is the story of the Veilithi, a species that had never met a human, had never wanted to, had spent the better part of 2 centuries lobbying the cooperative to keep the Deathworlders quarantined on the far side of the Reach. A species that was proud and ancient and civilized in all the ways humanity had never managed to be. A species that was dying. And the humans who came anyway. Fussed. Loud. All of them angry in that specific way humans get when something innocent is being hurt somewhere, and they're still too far away to stop it. The Veilithi sent one distress call. Earth sent 47 warships, 900,000 soldiers, and a message to the thing doing the killing that translated roughly into, "We are here now, and you should be afraid." What followed was not a battle. It was a reckoning. And this is how it happened. The distress call arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody on Earth particularly cared that it was a Tuesday. The people sitting in the deep monitoring station on the dark side of the lunar relay didn't care either. They were 3 analysts, one systems engineer named Priya Okafor who had been awake for 19 consecutive hours, and a machine intelligence called Moth that processed about 14 million signals per standard hour and flagged maybe a dozen worth human attention. Moth flagged this one inside of 3 seconds. Not because the signal was loud. It wasn't. It was barely above the noise floor, badly compressed, wrapped in a carrier frequency the station's hardware wasn't even primarily tuned for. It came in sideways, basically, like someone had thrown a message in a bottle, not into the ocean, but into a river, hoping the current would carry it somewhere that mattered. The bottle had traveled 612 light hours. It arrived fragmented, partially decoded, and absolutely unmistakable in its intent. Priya heard it played back through her earpiece and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the recycled air in the station. She pulled the translation layer up on her secondary screen. Moth had already run 4 passes. The language matrix was confident on about 60% of the content. The other 40% was either corrupted beyond recovery or structured in emotional contextual layers that the matrix flagged as culturally idiomatic and not directly translatable. What it had was enough. Help us. They are taking our children. We have been transmitting for many hours. We do not know if anyone is listening. The Veilith homeworld is burning in the outer ring. Our ships cannot fight them. Our weapons are not made for this kind of war. We are not a war species. We were never a war species. We built things. We grew things. We studied the light of distant stars, and we named every one of them because we believed the universe was a place worth knowing. They are taking our children. Please, if any civilization receives this, please, we are the Veilithi, and we are asking, we are begging, someone come. Priya stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, she hit the emergency uplink. Moth, she said, send this up the chain. Full flag. All priority channels. Sending, Moth said. How long has this signal been broadcasting? First detectable trace in our passive array was approximately 6 hours and 14 minutes ago. Based on propagation modeling, the signal originated approximately 4 hours before that. The Veilithi have been transmitting for roughly 10 hours, and we're just now catching it. The carrier frequency was non-standard. It was routed through a cooperative relay in a tertian band. We do not monitor that band as a primary intake. The signal was filtered as background noise for the first 6 hours. Moth correction protocols reflagged it during a routine sweep 14 minutes ago. Priya stared at the decoded text again. They're taking our children. Has the cooperative received this? Moth was quiet for exactly 1.3 seconds, which was forever by its processing standards. Yes. The Cooperative Monitoring Authority logged the signal approximately 40 minutes before our relay caught it. It has been formally flagged and entered into the emergency response queue. Estimated time to initial committee review is 9 hours. 9 hours. Yes. And then what? Committee review. Followed by threat assessment. Followed by species-specific resource allocation review. Followed by a joint session with the Cooperative Security Directorate, which currently has a backlog of stop. Priya closed her eyes. How long before they deploy anything? Moth processed this. Based on historical cooperative emergency response timelines for Category 4 or higher civilian distress events, initial response force assembly typically begins between 4 and 7 standard months after formal flagging, provided the budget review, 4 months. To 6. Priya pulled her headset off. She set it on the console very carefully. She looked at the decoded message on her screen one more time. Asterisk, we are not a war species. We built things. We grew things. Asterisk, she thought about children. She didn't have any. She had a sister back in Lagos who had 2, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old who both called Priya auntie in that specific delighted voice that 4-year-olds use when someone they love walks through the door. She put her headset back on. Moth. Flag this directly to Earth Defense Command. Priority 1. Skip the cooperative routing. That's outside standard protocol. I know. Flagging. The message hit Earth Defense Command's central hub in 0.4 seconds. It hit the desk of Admiral Constance Mwangi in 12 minutes, because that was how long it took her duty officer to decide whether to wake her up at 0300 or let it sit until morning. He decided to wake her. He made the right call. Admiral Constance Mwangi was 58 years old and had spent 31 of those years in uniform. She had a face that had stopped being easy to read sometime around her 40th birthday, which was when she'd been in command of the relief action at Corridor 7, and had learned that the expression most useful for keeping a crew functional under catastrophic stress was no expression at all. Just steadiness. Just the flat, present, working face of someone who had already processed the horror privately, and was now moving. She read the distress call twice. She read Mott's analysis of cooperative response timelines once. She called her Chief of Operations, Brigadier General Yusuf Adeyemi, at 0314. Yusuf, I need you awake. I am awake. Did you get the relay? A pause. She could hear him breathing. Getting it now. A longer pause. Sweet God, what do we have on the Veilithi? Pulling it. She heard him moving, the soft sounds of a man transitioning from sleep to operational mode with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 100 times. They're in the outer ring of the cooperative. 6th-tier member species. Non-combatant designation. Their homeworld is Veilith Prime, roughly 640 light hours from our current monitoring position. Population approximately 4.2 billion. Civilization age approximately 9,000 standard years. He paused. Priya's notes says they've been lobbying to keep us out of the inner cooperative for 2 centuries. I know. They don't like us. I know. They think we're dangerous. Yusuf. What? Are we going to help them? There was a silence on the line that lasted maybe 4 seconds. Outside her window, Earth turned in its slow, ancient roll. She could see the lights of the continent below her orbital station, the warm orange sprawl of cities built by a species that had clawed its way up from nothing and never once stopped being afraid of the dark, which was perhaps why they were so consistently angry when something in the dark went after someone who couldn't fight back. Yes, Yusuf said. Good. I need a full deployment brief on my screen in 90 minutes. What can we launch within 6 hours? She heard him exhale. Within 6 hours? We've got the 7th Rapid Response Fleet on standby rotation. That's 14 warships, fully provisioned. We can add the third heavy carrier group if we rush the resupply cycle. That's another 8 ships and roughly 24,000 ground troops. The shock Armada elements from the Kepler station are already at 60% readiness. Get them to 100. Constance, Yusuf, that's 47 ships. I know. That's our entire rapid response capability for this sector. I know. If something else happens while we're deployed, something is already happening, Yusuf. Her voice was quiet. It was the voice she used when she was most certain. It was the flattest, stillest voice she owned. And the people who had served with her long enough knew that when she used it, she had already done all the arguing with herself. The decision was made. The rest was logistics. Something is happening right now, to a species that can't stop it, to a population of 4 billion people who are watching their children get taken and have been screaming into the dark for 10 hours. The cooperative will meet about it in 9 hours and deploy in 4 to 6 months. She paused. We're going to be there in a week. Another silence. Yes, sir, Yusuf said. His voice was different now. Settled. She recognized the shift. He'd just made the same decision she had. I'll have the brief ready in 60 minutes. She ended the call. She stood at her window for 30 more seconds, looking at Earth, which was green and blue and ancient and scarred and brilliant and utterly uninterested in being a quiet planet. Then she turned and went to work. In the outer ring, the Veilithi burned. The species that was attacking them had no name in any cooperative database. They had been encountered twice before, both times by outer ring civilizations, both times briefly, both times ending in the attacking species retreating before any meaningful contact could be made. They moved in ships that were large and blunt-edged and covered in a biomechanical coating that absorbed sensor pings and returned confused, fractured data. They communicated in a frequency range that sat just outside anything the cooperative's translation infrastructure was built for. They'd been hitting Veilithi population centers for 11 days, not destroying them. The infrastructure on the ground was mostly intact. The orbital defense platforms had been disabled surgically, their weapons systems cut out with a precision that suggested detailed foreknowledge of their architecture. The agricultural networks were untouched. The medical systems were untouched. The power grids were untouched. What was being taken was the population, specifically the young ones, the children, the Veilithi under a certain physical developmental threshold that the attackers appeared to be identifying with scanner sweeps before each raid. They moved in small, fast insertion craft. They were fast, efficient, and methodical. They had hit 46 settlements across 3 continents and 2 orbital habitats in 11 days. The number of missing Veilithi children was, by the latest count in the distress signal data, somewhere north of 200,000. The Veilithi government had dispatched every defense asset they had. They were not a war species. Their military existed for customs enforcement, disaster response, and the occasional piracy suppression mission in their local space lanes. Their warships were lightly armed, lightly armored, and crewed by people whose training covered threat assessment and evacuation protocols and not much else. They had lost 19 ships in 11 days. The attackers had lost none. The Veilithi Council had been transmitting distress calls on every available frequency for the last 60 hours. The cooperative had logged and flagged them all. Nobody had come. In a settlement called Veilith Sora, a mid-sized coastal city, population roughly 800,000, known for its university and its tidal gardens and its annual light festival that people travel from across the planet to attend, a Veilithi citizen named Ethi was sitting in a basement with 34 children and a communication relay she had salvaged from a disabled defense drone. Ethi was not a soldier. She was a marine biologist. She had spent 15 years studying the deep current ecosystems in the Veilith Oceans, and she had 3 children of her own, all of whom were in this basement with her, and she had been transmitting on every frequency she could reach for 6 hours. She didn't know if anyone was listening. She kept transmitting anyway. She described what she was seeing. The ships, the insertion craft, the scanners they used, the pattern of their movements, always at night, always targeting the same developmental threshold, always withdrawing before local defense response could fully mobilize. She described the children who were gone. She described the families that were left. She described the university that had gone silent 3 days ago because half its student population had been taken and the other half had locked themselves in their dormitories. She described her own children, Tavi, who was 7, and Lane, who was 9, and small Sori, who was 4, and did not understand what was happening but understood that her mother's hands were shaking and kept pressing her head against Ethy's side, as if she could hold her in place by weight alone. "I am not a leader," Ethy said into the relay. "I'm not a soldier. I'm a scientist. I study the ocean. I believe the universe is a place worth knowing and worth protecting, and I am asking whoever receives this, I am begging, please come. Please come now. We cannot do this alone." The signal propagated outward at the speed of light. 612 light hours away, Priya Okafor was putting on her headset. Admiral Mwangi's deployment brief was ready in 58 minutes. The shock Armada launched at 0612 Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time. 47 ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, 23 fighter wings, 7 artillery battalions configured for orbital-to-surface support, 4 hospital ships, because Admiral Mwangi had fought enough battles to know that rescue operations look like combat operations until they look like triage operations, and she intended to be ready for both. The fleet moved in formation through the Earth Relay Gate at 0614. On the bridge of the flagship, EDS Relentless, Admiral Mwangi stood at the forward display and watched the stars shift as the gate drive engaged. Her operations officer, Commander Riku Tanaka, appeared at her shoulder. Riku was 34, brilliant, and constitutionally incapable of not saying the thing on his mind, which was both his greatest professional liability and the reason she kept him close. "We're going to arrive in a system we have no tactical survey of," he said, "with no force posture intel, against an enemy we've never encountered, to protect a population that actively doesn't want us there." "Yes," Mwangi said. "The Veilithi have been lobbying for years to keep humans out of their territory. I know. They think we're aggressive and unpredictable." Mwangi glanced at him sideways. "Are they wrong?" Riku opened his mouth, closed it. "In this specific instance," he said carefully, "I think aggressive and unpredictable is exactly what's needed." She turned back to the display. The stars outside were doing the impossible, beautiful, slightly stomach-dropping thing they did during a gate transit. "Send a message ahead of us on the long-range comms. Veilithi government channels, their distress frequency, anything we can reach." What should it say? She thought about a marine biologist in a basement with 34 children and shaking hands and 6 hours of unanswered transmissions. "Tell them we heard them," she said. "Tell them we're coming. Tell them to hold on." Riku moved to relay the message. Outside, the shock Armada crossed into the dark. 47 ships, burning hard through 600 light hours of silence, carrying everything humanity had decided was worth sending when the universe stopped being a place worth knowing and started being a place worth fighting for. They were 7 days out. The Veilithi had been burning for 11. In the basement in Veilith Sora, Ethy held Sori against her side and kept transmitting and tried to believe that someone was listening. She did not know that 47 warships were already moving. She did not know that a woman named Constance Mwangi had read her words and set her jaw and made a phone call at 3 in the morning that had set the largest rapid deployment fleet in human history in motion inside of 90 minutes. She did not know that the species she had spent her entire adult life being afraid of was now the only thing moving fast enough to matter. She transmitted another update on the attackers' movement patterns and held her children tighter and waited. The dark held her signal. The dark also, 600 light hours away and closing, held something else. Something that had been built on a world that never once decided to be gentle. Something that had learned a very long time ago that the only answer to a thing hurting an innocent in the dark was to go into the dark and be worse. Something that was moving very fast and was very angry and was almost there. The fleet moved through the dark between stars, and the dark did not care. That was the thing about deep space transit that nobody briefed you on in the academy, no matter how many simulations you ran or how many technical documents you absorbed in the long months of training. The briefings covered gate mechanics, relativistic drift corrections, formation discipline during superluminal transit, fuel consumption optimization. They did not cover what happened to human beings when they spent 7 days in the nothing between one world and another. The nothing was not empty. It was the opposite of empty. It was full of its own particular kind of weight. The weight of the distance, of the scale, of the absolute indifference of the universe to whether you arrived or not. The stars outside the viewports were different stars. The constellations were wrong. Everything familiar was behind them, and everything ahead was a situation report they were still reading and rereading and understanding worse the more they understood it. On EDS Relentless, the briefings were constant. Admiral Mwangi ran 3 full command briefings in the first 24 hours of transit. She pulled every piece of intelligence on the attackers that Earth's databases held, which was not much. 2 prior encounters, both logged by Outer Ring species, both ending in the attackers withdrawing. No confirmed casualties on the attacking side from either encounter. No decoded communications. No confirmed ID on their biology, their homeworld, their political structure, their motivation, their resource requirements, or their military doctrine. What they had were sensor logs from Veilithi defense platforms before those platforms went dark, and Ethi's transmissions. Ethi had been transmitting for 41 hours before the human fleet picked up her signal. By the time Relentless entered gate transit, her relay had been silent for 12 hours. The battery in her salvage drone relay had given out sometime around hour 19 of their transit. She might have found another power source. She might not have. The intelligence team, Lieutenant Commander Femi Osei at the head, with 3 analysts who hadn't slept more than 5 hours since launch, had built a preliminary tactical picture from everything Ethi had transmitted before her relay died. They called it preliminary, and meant it with all the anxiety that word could carry because the picture was thin and the gaps were enormous, and everyone in the briefing room was very aware that they were building a combat plan around the observations of a marine biologist hiding in a basement. The attackers are operating in a 2-phase pattern, Osei said, pulling up the display. He was tall and precise in the way that people get when they have been trained to present uncertainty clearly without letting it become paralysis. Phase 1 is orbital suppression. They disabled defense platforms first, clean surgical targeting, no collateral destruction. This tells us they have detailed foreknowledge of Veilithi military architecture. How they got it is unknown. Phase 2 is ground insertion. Small fast craft, operating at night, carrying scanner equipment that identifies targets by biological developmental marker. They extract. They withdraw. The display showed a map of the affected settlements. 46 points, spread across 3 continents and 2 orbital habitats. Each at a neighborhood, a school, a residential quarter, a transit hub. Each at a specific number of children gone. Do we have a count? Admiral Mwangi asked. Osei's jaw tightened a fraction. 247,000 at last confirmed count from Veilithi Civil Authority transmissions before their own comms infrastructure was partially disrupted. That's 11 days into the operation. If the same rate has continued, it's higher now. Significantly. The room was quiet for a moment. Not a heavy theatrical quiet, just the working quiet of people absorbing data and building implications. Where are the attackers' ships positioned? Commander Riku Tanaka asked. That's one of our biggest intelligence gaps, Osei said. The Veilithi sensor data shows 3 to 5 large vessels in high orbit during each raid. They use a biomechanical hull coating that scatters sensor returns. The Veilithi data is full of ghosts, doubled returns, false positives. What we can say with moderate confidence is that there are at minimum 3 capital-class vessels and an unknown number of smaller support craft. The insertion craft come in groups of 6 to 12 per raid site. Riku was quiet for a moment, running the numbers. 3 capital ships, he said. At minimum, we have 47. Yes. Riku looked at the Admiral. She could see him deciding whether to say the thing on his mind or keep it professional. He kept it professional, which meant he thought it very loudly at her across the briefing table and let her decide to ignore it. The thing he was thinking was, this should not be a fair fight. The thing she was thinking back was, good. Weapons profile? She asked. Based on the orbital platform takedowns, they're running some variant of directed energy weapons. The platforms were cut rather than smashed, precise heat and focus signatures, not kinetic impact. Ground reports describe insertion craft armed with what sounds like some kind of incapacitation system rather than lethal weapons, which is consistent with a capture-not-kill operational goal. They're taking them alive, said Colonel Adiz Ikena, Ground Forces commander, from her seat at the far end of the table. She had been quiet until this point. Her voice was very flat and very even. She had 2 sons, 12 and 9. Everyone in the room knew this, and nobody was mentioning it. They want them alive. That's why the infrastructure is intact. That's why they're not just destroying settlements. Yes, Osei said, which means Ikena continued, still flat, still even, the children who have been taken are alive. Unless whatever they want them for, we cannot know that, Mwangi said. Not cutting her off. Cutting the thought off before it ran somewhere nobody in the room could afford to follow it with a week of transit still ahead. What we can plan around is the working assumption that we are looking at a rescue mission alongside a combat operation. Both simultaneously. That changes our priorities. She looked at the display. We don't just need to stop them. We need to know where the children are. Which means we need at least one of their ships intact enough to give us data. The room absorbed this. That's a significant operational constraint, Riku said. Everything about this mission is a significant operational constraint, Riku. Yes, sir. She stood. The map glowed in the center of the table. 247,000 points of light that were not points of light, but children who had been taken by something the universe had not yet named. I want tactical planning groups assembled by this evening. Ground insertion protocols, orbital suppression doctrine, sensor ghost countermeasures for their hull coating, and a separate team working exclusively on how we take a ship without destroying it. She paused, quietly, fast, and without being wrong about what we're looking at. That's the brief. And the Veilithi? Ikena asked. They don't know we're coming. The message we sent may not have reached their government. Their comms infrastructure is partially compromised. We may arrive in system announced only to ourselves. Mwangi looked around the table. Which means our first contact with a species that has spent 2 centuries being afraid of us may happen at the worst possible moment, in the middle of an active combat situation, when they have no context for why 47 human warships just emerged from gate transit in their home system. A very specific silence. So they might shoot at us, Riku said. Their weapons won't do much to us. That's not really the point. No, she agreed. It's not. She thought for a moment. Communications team. I want a first contact protocol drafted specifically for this scenario. We come in with weapons hot because we have to, but I want our intent transmitted on every frequency they use, every diplomatic channel, every emergency override. I want them to know before they can make a mistake they'll regret. Understood, said her communications chief. The meeting broke. People moved with the contained urgency of professionals who had work to do and not enough time to do it in. Mwangi stood at the display for a moment after the room cleared, looking at the map, looking at 46 dots. She thought about Ethi. She'd read every transcript of her transmissions. The woman was methodical. She described the attacker's movement patterns with the observational precision of someone who spent her career watching ecosystems, noting timing, noting behavior, noting the small deviations that suggested a logic underneath the pattern. She'd been scared, and her relay was running out of power, and she'd still been transmitting field intelligence at 3 in the morning in a basement with 34 children, and she'd never once stopped. Mwangi respected that more than she could easily articulate. She pulled up the last recorded transmission on her personal screen. Ethi's voice filtered through 600 light hours of propagation and a failing power cell. I'm not a soldier. I study the ocean. I believe the universe is a place worth knowing. Mwangi stood with that for a moment. Then, she went to plan the operation. On the lower decks of Relentless, the soldiers did what soldiers do in transit. They trained. They argued. They played games that involved small amounts of money and large amounts of competitive aggression redirected sideways from the actual situation. They cleaned their weapons repeatedly, not because the weapons needed it, but because cleaning a weapon was something to do with your hands when your mind was running the scenarios it was going to run no matter what you told it. Sergeant First Class Tomas Guerrero, D Company, 3rd Battalion, 17 Shock Infantry, had cleaned his rifle twice and was working on a 3rd pass. He was 27, from a city that used to be called Mexico City and was now just called the city because it had gotten big enough that the country name felt redundant. And he had been in uniform for 8 years, and he had 3 deployments under his belt, and none of them had felt quite like this. The others in the squad bay were all doing their own version of the same thing. Corporalina Park was running tactical simulations on a hand display and had been running the same one for the 3rd consecutive hour. Private Deshi Okonkwo, 18 years old, and on his first deployment, was very carefully not looking scared while being clearly scared. Specialist Ama Vasquez was asleep or doing a very good impression of it. You know what bothers me, said Private Deshi to nobody in particular. Many things bother you, Tomas said, not looking up from his rifle. They've been doing this for 11 days. Deshi was looking at the ceiling. 247,000 kids. That's 11 days. That's a rate of, he paused, doing the math. That's 22,000 a day. More, probably. They've been doing it, and the cooperative knew, and nobody Deshi. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. Tomas set the rifle down. He looked at the kid who was 18 and on his first deployment and doing the math on 22,000 children a day and handling it about as well as any decent person should, which was badly. Here's what you do with that. You put it right there. He touched the center of his own chest. Right there. You keep it there. And when we arrive, you let that be what moves you. Not anger that makes you reckless. Just that. The number. The children. You keep that. And you do the job. Deshi was quiet. Okay, he said. Okay, Tomas agreed. He picked up his rifle again. She's going to be clean enough soon, Lena said without looking up from her simulation. Not yet. You've done it 3 times. Almost clean. Lena made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Sergeant Guerrero is going to arrive in an alien system with the most pristine weapon in the fleet. Exactly right. And what if they don't need us to shoot anyone? What if it's purely a diplomatic situation? Tomas looked at her. She was looking at her simulation. Not at him, but there was something underneath the dry tone. She was doing the same math Deshi was doing. They all were. Then, I'll have a very clean rifle at the diplomatic summit. Fair point. Deshi had started cleaning his own weapon. Tomas watched him without appearing to watch him. The kid had the movements right. He was learning. Across the fleet, in 900,000 other moments just like this one, soldiers were cleaning weapons and running simulations and doing math and holding numbers against their chests and preparing. 7 days wasn't long. 600 light hours was a lot of dark. But the dark was finite, and the fleet moved through it. On day 4 transit, they made contact, not with the enemy, with the Veilithi. The message came through on a frequency that Relentless S Communications team had been monitoring on the off chance. The same carrier band Ethi's relay had been using, which the analyst had identified as the Veilithi's de facto emergency frequency for the duration of the crisis. The signal was stronger than Ethi's had been. It was coming from a functioning transmitter. It was directed, not broadcasting omnidirectionally, but aimed, pointed outward with the specific orientation of a signal that was trying to reach something it believed was out there. The Veilithi government had gotten Wangi's message. They had gotten it, and they had not believed it, and they had verified it through 3 separate cooperative relay channels, and they had then had a very long internal argument, transcripts of which the communications team decoded with the help of an existing cooperative standard Veilithi language matrix. And the argument had been, roughly, are these humans really coming? Yes. How many? 47 warships. Is this a trap? Why would it be a trap? Because they are the humans. Because we have spent 2 centuries being afraid of this exact thing. Humanity deploying overwhelming military force in our territory. This is different. How is it different? Because they are coming to help us. Are they? And then, a voice Mwangi didn't recognize, older, she thought, or at least carrying a particular kind of weight that older voices carry, had said, Asterisk, I read the message from Admiral Mwangi 3 times. I do not know if humans are what we believe them to be, or something else. I know that our children are gone, and nobody came. And I know that whatever the humans are, they are coming. And they're the only ones coming. Asterisk, the signal directed at Relentless was from the same voice. The translation matrix processed it. Lieutenant Commander Osei brought it to the bridge personally. They want to talk, he said. Mwangi looked at the transcript on the screen. Who is it? Elder Council Speaker. Highest-ranking Veilithi government official currently accessible. Their planetary government is partially dispersed. Some council members have been moved to secure locations. Others are managing the crisis from the ground. This is the senior person available. Mwangi nodded. Open the channel. The translation protocols were imperfect. They'd get better with exposure, but right now they were working with a second-hand cooperative matrix that wasn't calibrated for Veilithi emotional contextual layers. The voice that came through was filtered and slightly compressed. Admiral Mwangi, said the voice. It had no obvious gender analog, which the translation matrix noted was common in Veilithi communication. Their language did not encode the distinction in the same way. We received your message. We did not know if it was real. It is real, Mwangi said. Her communications officer was feeding the translation in real time. We are 7 days from your system. We are coming with everything we have. A pause that the matrix flagged as culturally significant. A deliberate beat in Veilithi communication that indicated the speaker was either gathering themselves or choosing their words with particular care. Why? The voice said. Mwangi had been expecting a logistical question. Weapons load, fleet composition, tactical plan. Not that one. She answered it as directly as she knew how. Because you called. Because your children are being taken and nobody was moving fast enough. Because there isn't a version of this where we do nothing and that's acceptable. Another pause. We have spent a long time being afraid of you, the voice said. Your species. What you are. I know. You're a Deathworld species. Your history is I know what our history is. We were afraid that one day humans would deploy military force in our space, and it would be the end of us. Mwangi was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the dark continued to be dark. And now we're deploying military force in your space, she said. Yes, and it won't be the end of you. She paused. I understand why you were afraid of us. I understand why you still might be. But right now, in this moment, I need you to tell me everything you know about where those children might be held, and I need you to let us do what we came to do. A long pause. The longest one yet. We will tell you everything, the voice said. We have been studying the attackers. We have been doing everything a species that is not a war species can do to understand an enemy we cannot fight. We will give you all of it. Good. Mwangi nodded at Osei, who had his recording systems live. Then, let's get to work. The channel stayed open for 14 hours. By the time it closed, the tactical picture had filled in significantly. The attackers had a name now. Not their own name for themselves, which was unknown, but a designation. The Ve'alethi called them the Harvesters because that was what they were. A species or organization or some other category that the Ve'alethi didn't have perfect words for, that moved through outer ring systems on a cycle that their best astronomers estimated as roughly every 70 to 80 standard years, that targeted non-combatant species with developing age young, that took them and withdrew and left nothing behind. They had been here before. Ve'alethi records, ancient ones, nearly 8,000 years old, describe something similar. Ships in the sky, children taken. No explanation. The ancient Ve'alethi had believed it was a divine phenomenon. A test. An ascension. They had built mythology around it. The Elder Council speaker said this with the particular tone of someone who had spent the last 11 days watching the mythology become real and finding it had no divine meaning at all. Just loss. Just children gone. They came before, Mwangi said. Yes. 70 to 80 years ago. And the time before that. And the time before that. Yes, and the cooperative did not exist 8,000 years ago. And in the modern era, a pause. The cooperative noted the encounters in their records. They assessed it as low priority. The harvesters withdraw after each cycle. They do not destroy. They do not colonize. They are considered a nuisance event in cooperative security doctrine. Mwangi sat with that for a moment. A nuisance event, she said. Yes. She looked at the map. 247,000 dots that were not dots. How many children did they take in the previous cycle? Our records suggest the number was similar. Historical references indicate entire cohorts of young Ve'alethi missing from population records of the period. We believe for a long time that it was plague, disease. We found the true accounting only 60 years ago when an archaeologist discovered a set of records in a deep archive library that had been sealed for 6,000 years. 60 years ago, Mwangi said, and the harvesters are back in 80. We had 20 years, the speaker said. We knew they were coming. We were not a war species. We did not know how to prepare. We asked the cooperative for support. They said we were a non-combatant designation. They said military resource allocation for non-member tier threats required. Committee review. Mwangi said. Yes. She looked at the tactical display. She looked at the space between where they were and where they needed to be. 3 days left. We will be there in 3 days, she said. Brief me on everything you have on their ship positions. We're going to find where they're keeping your children, and we're going to take them back. The speaker was quiet for a moment. Admiral, the voice said, why does your species do this? You have nothing to gain from coming here. We have not been a pause. We have not been kind to you. In the cooperative, we have worked against your expansion. Mwangi almost said something political. She had a political answer ready. Something about the solidarity of sapient species, something about the cooperative charter, something that would go into the official record cleanly. She had been in uniform long enough to know the shape of official answers. She set aside. There are 247,000 children missing, she said. That's the answer. The channel was quiet. We will send you everything we have, the speaker said finally. The data came through 18 minutes later. It was not much. It was everything the Ve'alethi had. It was enough to plan with. 3 days out, The shock armada burned harder, and the dark got shorter, and the fleet's tactical brain, 900,000 soldiers, 47 ships, 3 days, and a plan still being written, worked through the night on a problem that the universe had apparently been putting off for 80 years, and humanity had apparently decided to solve in a week. In the basement in Valithsora, if Ethi was still there, it was dark and quiet and full of the specific kind of waiting that has no good end in sight. The fleet did not know if she was still there, but it was moving like she was. Gate emergence was never subtle. The physics didn't allow for subtle. You were not there, and then you were there, and the transition between those two states involved a bloom of energy that lit up every sensor array within about 400,000 kilometers and made a sound. Not an actual sound, space being famously bad at carrying those, but a particular kind of resonant frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum that translated in sensor systems as something very close to a thud. 47 ships, emerging from gate transit in rapid sequence, did not thud. They announced. The first sensor team on Relentless had the tactical picture updated within 90 seconds of emergence. They were in the outer Vailithi system, further out than the homeworld, giving the fleet time to assess before committing to the inner system, which was standard doctrine, and also in this specific case was what had allowed them to see what was there before anything reacted to their presence. What was there was worse than the briefings had suggested. Commander Rika Tanaka was at the sensor display, and he went very still in a way that Mwangi had learned to read as the specific human response to a gap between expectation and reality that was large enough to require a moment of internal recalibration. Report, she said. 7 capital-class vessels in high orbit, he said. Not 3, 7. He was watching the display update as the sensor array built its picture. And he paused. 42 support craft of various configurations in mid-orbit. And, Admiral, their ships in the outer system. Running minimal power. Cold drifting. He looked up. They're positioned at every viable exit vector from the system. Blockade, Mwangi said. Partial. They're not fully sealed. The coverage has gaps. But the intent reads as containment. They want to make sure nothing leaves. Mwangi stood at the display and built the picture. 7 capital ships. 42 support craft. An unknown number of cold drifting blockade elements at the exit vectors. Against her 47 warships. The numbers were what they were. She ran the engagement math, and she ran it again, and she let herself feel for exactly 1 second the weight of the gap between what the briefings had said and what she was looking at. And then she put it down because the gap was the operational reality now, and the operational reality required solving, not grieving. Weapon status? She asked. All ships reporting combat ready, said the tactical officer. We entered emergence with weapons hot per pre-transit orders. Good. What's the enemy doing? They're reacting. The sensor display showed movement. Energy signatures spiking on 3 of the 7 capital ships. The emergence bloom got their attention. They're repositioning, bringing their orbital axis around. They're going to engage. Looks like it. Then, we don't have time to be elegant. Mwangi turned to the communication station. Are the Vailithi frequencies active? Yes, sir. The ground-based relays are patchy, but the Elder Council speaker's dedicated frequency is clear. Open it. I need them to know we're here and what's about to happen so nobody in their system takes a shot at us by accident. She turned to Tanaka. Split the fleet. I want 15 ships to hold outer position and begin identifying those cold drift blockade elements. Light them up, track them. Don't engage unless they engage first. I want the remaining 32 in the inner system within 6 minutes. Formation Kestrel. Point elements forward, carrier wings in the 2nd tier, hospital ships to the 3rd tier, and keep them clean. Tanaka was relaying before she finished the sentence. And find me those children, Mwangi said to the intelligence station. That's the mission. Everything else is cover for the mission. The Vailithi Elder Council speaker heard the burst transmission from Relentless at 0417 local time and understood about 60% of it directly and another 20 through context. The humans were in the system. The humans were engaging. The council chamber where the speaker sat had windows that faced the sky, and the sky was beginning to show things. Small points of light that moved. Energy blooms at the edge of atmosphere. The very distant but unmistakable visual signatures of weapons fire, bright enough to see across orbital distance because the weapons involved were large enough to make brightness that traveled that far. The speaker transmitted a system-wide alert to every Veilithi frequency. Asterisk to all citizens. To all defense assets. To all community shelters. Human vessels from Earth have entered our system. They are engaging the harvesters. Do not fire on human ships. Repeat, do not fire on human ships. They are here at our request. This is confirmed. Asterisk the speaker sat back in the chair and watched the sky begin to fill with light. 8,000 years of mythology. A test. An ascension. Divine judgment. It was 47 warships from a death world that the cooperative had spent decades trying to quarantine. The speaker was not sure what that meant about the universe. But it felt, watching the light begin to happen in the high atmosphere, like something significant. Like the universe had made a correction. The battle above Valeth Prime began in the way that battles between mismatched forces begin. Chaotically, loudly, and with a great deal of initial confusion on the side that had been caught flat-footed. The harvesters had been in a system with a non-combatant species for 11 days. They had disabled the orbital defense network in the first 72 hours. They had been operating with impunity. They had their ships positioned for their own operational efficiency, not for a combat engagement with 47 warships from a species they had apparently never encountered and had certainly never planned for. The first harvester capital ship to orient on the emerging human fleet had its main weapons array operational within 4 minutes of emergence detection. It fired twice before the lead human warship, EDS Aegis, responded. Aegis Astros took both shots and kept moving. This was not expected by the harvesters. The harvester weapons, which had been so effective against the Veilithi defense platforms, were directed energy systems optimized for precision surgical work. The Veilithi had used lightly armored, lightly shielded platforms. They had not been designed to absorb a prolonged direct energy assault, just to detect and respond to it. Aegis Asterisk was not a Veilithi defense platform. Aegis Asterisk was a warship from a species that had built warships specifically to survive combat environments, which had been refined through several hundred years of actual combat experience, which had gone through 17 major design iterations based on things learned in engagements that the cooperative security doctrine had classified as minor incidents in the outer systems and which the humans involved had classified as lessons. Aegis Asterisk took both shots, lost a secondary sensor array on its port side, and fired back. The Harvester capital ship lost its weapons array. Then, it lost its engine section. Then it listed badly to one side and began a slow orbital decay that the second human ship in formation, EDS Patience, immediately began tracking to ensure it would not deorbit directly over a populated area. This happened in about 90 seconds. The other 6 Harvester capital ships reacted. They spread formation, lit up their weapons arrays, and began the coordinated attack pattern that Harvester Doctrine apparently called for in a multi-threat engagement, which involved concentrating fire on the largest target, while the smaller support craft began withdrawal sequences to protect whatever operational cargo they were currently carrying. The withdrawal sequences were what the human fleet had been waiting for. They're pulling their support craft back, Tanaka reported. The small fast insertion craft, they're moving toward the capital ships. The children, Mwangi said. That's the assumption. They're consolidating whatever they've taken. He tracked the movement on the display. The consolidation point looks like he ran the vectors. Harvester Capital Ship 3, mid-orbit, roughly 42,000 kilometers above the northern continent. It's receiving the most support traffic. That's where they're keeping them. Working assumption. Mwangi looked at the display. Capital Ship 3 was also the one that was positioning itself to use 2 others as cover. Clearly understood itself to be a target to protect. Around it, 6 capital ships and dozens of support craft were engaging the human fleet in a fight that was becoming enormous and bright and very loud in the electromagnetic spectrum. Colonel Ikena, Mwangi said. Sir. Ikena's voice came through from the ground forces command ship, EDS Hammer. We're going for Ship 3. I need a boarding plan. I have 3 versions ready. Which one doesn't blow the ship up? That would be version 2. Use version 2. What do you need? A corridor, Ikena said. 8 to 12 minutes of the capital ship, 3, being unable to maneuver freely while we close to boarding range. And suppression of its point defense before we launch drop pods. You'll have it. Mwangi switched back to tactical. Tanaka, capital ship 3. I need it pinned, and its defenses stripped. What's it going to cost us? Tanaka was already running it. We send in 6 ships, mixed composition. They're going to take fire from at least 3 other capital ships to do it. He paused. We'll take damage. How much damage? Real damage. Not critical, probably. But we're going to have ships that need repair after this. Okay, Tanaka said, and went to work. Sergeant Tomas Guerrero was in a drop pod when the order came through. He had been in a drop pod before. He had been in drop pods in 3 prior deployments, in situations that had ranged from a hostage extraction from a compromised colonial station to a full-scale combat landing on a world that had been taken by a separatist force and had needed to be untaken. He knew the particular quality of the time spent in a drop pod before the drop. The waiting, the weight of the gear, the specific sound of his own breathing amplified in the sealed helmet. He had never been in a drop pod heading for an alien ship that he had never been inside, in an alien star system, to retrieve children of species he had never met from beings whose biology and weapons and capabilities were partially unknown. The intelligence summary had been thorough, given the constraints. The analysts had done excellent work in 3 days with limited data. The operational brief was solid. Colonel Ikena's version 2 boarding plan was as good as a plan could be when it was built on partial information and the fundamental understanding that contact with reality would require improvisation. The fundamental understanding did not make the drop pod more comfortable. Time of contact, Deshi said. He was 2 pods over. Tomas could hear him on the squad channel. 14 minutes from launch order, Tomas said. We haven't launched yet. Right. A pause. How do we know the children are on that ship? We don't know. We're going where the data points. And if they're not on that ship, then we search the ship and get the data that tells us where they are. And if Deshi, yeah, clean rifle. A short pause. Clean rifle. Good. Outside the drop pod, the battle was happening. Tomas could feel it through the hull. Not sound, but vibration, the deep structural language of ship taking fire and absorbing it and continuing. Relentless was good at absorbing. He trusted the hull. He had to. The launch order came through at 0502 Valeth local time. He felt the drop sequence in his stomach first. Then, the pod was away. The corridor that 6 human warships carved through the Harvester formation to get EDS Hammer and her boarding force to capital ship 3 cost 3 of those ships significant damage, and one of them, EDS Meridian, a complete loss of its secondary reactor, and nearly a quarter of its crew in the following 40 minutes of controlled emergency response. The crew of Meridian handled it. They were trained for it. They had practiced the emergency protocols so many times that when the real thing happened, it moved through them like muscle memory, terrible and fast, and nearly perfect. Nearly. Hammer Asterisk reached boarding range with 32 seconds to spare on Ikena's timeline. The drop pods launched. Tomas Guerrero's pod hit the hull of Harvester Capital Ship 3 at 0514, traveling at a speed that the pod system immediately began counteracting with every available deceleration measure, which was a very polite way of saying that the impact was significant, and the occupants experienced several seconds of feeling like they were being pushed through a very small opening by something enormous. The maglock clamps grabbed the hull. The breach charge went. He was inside in 12 seconds. The interior of the Harvester ship was nothing like any human vessel he had ever boarded in training or deployment. That was expected, and the briefing had prepared him for it, as well as words could prepare anyone for a place that was completely, fundamentally, biology first rather than engineering first. The walls were not walls exactly. They were layers of the same biomechanical material the hull coating was made of, organized in ways that suggested growth more than construction. The corridors were not corridors exactly. They were passages that curved and narrowed and widened in patterns that had a logic that was not immediately apparent. The intelligence summary had described it as likely organic architecture with integrated mechanical systems, and had included a 3-page caveat about the limitations of that description. Tomas moved through it with his squad at combat pace, and trusted the floor plan that the analysts had reconstructed from sensor data, which was partial and imperfect, and the best they had. They hit resistance at the 3rd junction. The harvesters were not large. That was the first thing that registered. They were not the enormous armored creatures that a species capable of fielding 7 capital ships might have been expected to produce. They were smaller than humans, faster than humans, with a body configuration that was radically different, but used in ways that combat experience translated into readable tactical language. angles, cover, approach, weapon deployment. Their weapons were the incapacitation systems that Ethe had described. They worked by inducing a specific neural disruption that the human biology responded to differently than the Vealethi biology the weapons had been calibrated for. On a Vealethi, the effect was immediate, complete, and lasted about 6 hours. On a human, it produced disorientation, partial motor impairment, and a significant headache that several soldiers described later as the worst of their lives. It did not put them down. The harvesters at the third junction had not been expecting that. Tomas put 3 of them down in the first 8 seconds of contact. Lena took 2 more. Deshi froze for 1 second and then didn't freeze, and they were through the junction and moving, and the floor plan said the holding area was 2 levels down and 2 junctions forward, and the boarding clock said they had 11 minutes before Hammer's position became untenable. They moved. The holding area was not what the briefing had described. The briefing had said, large compartment, likely multiple, expect dozens of cages or containment units. Expect the children in groups. The briefing was working from sensor data filtered through the biomechanical hull material, which scattered readings, which had produced a reconstruction that was more art than science. There was one enormous compartment running the full length of what appeared to be the ship's central axis, and it was full of light. Warm, steady, bioluminescent light produced by the walls themselves. And in the light, in clean, structured conditions that looked nothing like a prison and nothing like the darkness Tomas had been bracing for, there were children. Thousands of them, not in cages. In what looked like, he had to find a word for it, and the word he found was nurseries. Small, organized spaces, many of them sleeping, all of them breathing, all of them clearly alive and intact and being maintained at a temperature and a humidity and a light level that the harvesters had clearly calibrated with deliberate care. He stood in the entrance to that compartment for exactly 3 seconds. Then he got on the command channel. Coronel Ikena, we have the holding area. Children confirmed alive. Situation is different from briefing. The compartment is large, single space, approximately, he tried to count. I can't count them. There are thousands. Ikena's voice was steady and very quiet. Status. Alive. Intact. I think they've been cared for. He ran the word through his understanding, and it still felt wrong given the context. They're sleeping. They're not injured. It looks deliberate. A pause. Okay. Ikena said. Okay. Hold position. Establish a perimeter. We're sending in the medical teams and the extraction units now. Yes, sir. Tomas turned to his squad. Lena was already moving inside, moving carefully, scanning for threats, moving the way she moved in training, precise, professional. Deshi was behind him. When Tomas looked at him, the kid's face was doing something complicated. The 18-year-old carrying the math of 22,000 children a day, looking at thousands of Vealethi children sleeping in warm light, and understanding all at once that they had actually made it to them. Okay, Deshi said. To himself, not to Tomas. Okay. Yeah, Tomas said. He established the perimeter. The medical teams came in 4 minutes later. On the surface of Vealith Prime, in the basement in Vealith Sora, Ethe had found a new power source 3 days ago, a neighbor's solar relay, disconnected from the main grid but still drawing from its panels. She had been transmitting on it since. She didn't know the fleet had arrived. She didn't know her children were being carried to extraction shuttles. She was still transmitting. Day 18, she said into the relay. The raids have slowed. I don't know why. 34 children still with me. We are safe. We are still here. If anyone is listening, the alert tone hit every Vealethi frequency simultaneously. The Elder Council speaker's voice, broadcasting system-wide. Citizens of Vealith Prime. The human shock armada has engaged the harvesters in our orbital space. Fighting is ongoing. We are receiving reports that human ground forces have boarded a harvester vessel in orbit and have located the children. Ethe stopped transmitting. She sat very still. Small Sori pressed her head against her mother's side. Lane and Tavi were awake now, looking at her with eyes that had spent 18 days learning to read their mother's face for safety signals. She made herself breathe. It's okay, she told them. It's okay. Her hands were shaking. She didn't try to stop them. Outside, through the basement's high narrow window, the sky was full of light. The battle above Vealith Prime lasted 19 hours. Not because 47 human warships needed 19 hours to defeat 7 harvester capital ships and their support fleet. The combat phase, The actual exchange of weapons fire, the maneuvering, the suppression runs, ran for about 4 hours before the Harvester formation fractured. 2 capital ships attempted a gate jump and were tracked and intercepted. 2 more were disabled and drifting. 1 was destroyed when its reactor went critical after a sustained fire from 3 human warships that had been trying very hard not to destroy it, and discovered that some equations have only one answer. 2 Harvester capital ships surrendered. This was unexpected. The fleet's intelligence summary had included a note, cautious and clearly uncomfortable with its own uncertainty, that it was unknown whether the Harvesters operated under surrender protocols or if the concept was part of their tactical doctrine at all. The note had turned out to be unnecessary. They surrendered in the most unambiguous way possible. Weapons offline, navigation offline, all energy outputs reduced to life support minimums. With a transmission on a frequency the fleet had been monitoring that translated, after 3 passes through the matrix, as something close to, "We yield." The other 15 hours were logistics. Logistics is not a glamorous word. It does not carry the weight that words like battle and victory carry. It does not have the narrative shape that people instinctively reach for when they want to describe something that mattered. But logistics was where the mission either worked or failed to work, and in this specific case, it was where the full scale of what the Harvesters had done over 11 days became undeniable. There were 261,418 Veilithi children aboard the Harvester vessels. The number came in 3 hours after the combat phase ended, when the medical teams had finished their initial sweep of all 5 vessels that were intact enough to be boarded. 261,000 and change, ranging from infants to early adolescents, all of them alive, all of them physically intact, none of them showing signs of the physical injury or deprivation that the human teams have been bracing for since the beginning. The Harvesters had been maintaining them carefully. That was the word the medical teams kept using and kept being slightly uncomfortable with. Carefully. There was a temperature regulation system in every holding space, a hydration and nutrition delivery system that was sophisticated enough to calibrate to individual Veilithi biology, a lighting system that mimicked natural Veilith light cycles. There were, and this was the detail that went through the fleet's communication channels in the 18 hours after the boarding and made people stop whatever they were doing and think about what it meant, materials that appear to be comfort objects. Soft materials in the children's spaces. Familiar textures. Things that a child might hold. The Harvesters had not been torturing them. They had been transporting them. Where? For what purpose? Why these specific developmental ages, these specific numbers, this specific 80-year cycle? No answers yet. The 2 surrendered ships were being processed by the intelligence teams, which was a slow work because the language gap was total. The fleet had no translation infrastructure for Harvester communication, which bore no relationship to any language in the cooperative database, which meant the intelligence teams were working from scratch on a problem that would normally take years and were trying to do it in hours. It was slow. The medical work was not slow. For hospital ships had been deployed. They were not big enough. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 261,000 children for hospital ships, and a Veilithi population surface below that needed to receive them, and a ground infrastructure that had been operating under siege conditions for 18 days and was patchy and overwhelmed and trying. What made it work was that the Veilithi came out. They had been in shelters, in basements, in community centers, in underground transit hubs, in the places you go when something is taking your children from the sky and you don't know where else to be. They came out when the system-wide alert announced the human fleet had arrived. They came out when the sky started filling with light that was different from the light of the raids. Larger, more diffuse, covering the whole sky rather than focusing on specific settlement points. They came out when their Elder Council speaker said the children were being found. The first shuttle came down at 0847 local time in the settlement of Veilith Sora. It landed in the main square because that was the largest flat space available, and the landing process generated a significant amount of dust and thermal disturbance, and the people standing in the square and the surrounding streets, thousands of them having assembled there since the system-wide announcement, standing in a morning light with the specific posture of people who had been told something they did not quite yet allow themselves to believe, stepped back from the landing column, and then, when the shuttle's cargo ramp came down, stepped forward. The shuttle carried 412 children. It was followed by another shuttle, and then another. The square was not equipped for this. The Veilithi civil administration had not had time to set up organized reception infrastructure. This was the first shuttle, and the process was being built in real time, and none of it was structured or organized in the way that relief operations look in briefings. It was messy. It was loud. It was the specific controlled chaos of a species that had been in grief for 18 days, meeting the possibility that the grief was ending. The humans who came off the shuttles with the children, medical personnel, soldiers who had been detailed to escort duty, specialists from the hospital ships, found themselves in something they had not been briefed for, which was a species that had been afraid of them for 2 centuries, responding to them in a way that was not afraid at all. Which was not to say the Veilithi were comfortable or relaxed, or had resolved their history with humanity in an afternoon, but which was to say that too. 161,000 children are a powerful argument against whatever theory you held before they started coming off the shuttles. Sergeant Tomas Guerrero had been on the shuttle with 412 children and 12 other soldiers serving as escort, and had spent the trip feeling profoundly underprepared for the emotional weight of the work, which was not combat work, and was not logistics work, and was something else that he didn't have a clean word for. The children were awake for the most part. They had been in the harvester ship for anywhere from 3 to 18 days. The younger ones were disoriented in the specific way that young children are when their environment changes without warning and without explanation. Some of them were calm. Some of them were crying. One very small Veilithi child had attached herself to Tomas's arm at the midpoint of the transit and had not released it, and he had carried his weapon one-handed for the rest of the flight because moving the child seemed wrong in a way he could not articulate. The Veilithi were physiologically different from humans in most of the ways that alien species tend to be. Larger eyes, secondary limbs that were more manipulative than locomotive, a body temperature that ran warmer than humans, an olfactory range that meant they experienced the presence of humans as a distinct sensory event. The children smelled different. They looked different. The small one on his arm was not a human child and shared no evolutionary history with him, and he felt, holding her on his arm while the shuttle came down through Veilith atmosphere, a violent protective impulse that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with the fact that she was small and frightened and holding on. The shuttle landed. The ramp came down. He walked out into a square full of Veilithi and noise and morning light and the very specific quality of air that is different from recycled atmosphere, which always hits you the same way on any world that has an open sky. And the small one on his arm made a sound that the translation matrix, which was still developing its Veilithi calibration, rendered as something close to a word that roughly mapped to mother. Something in the crowd heard it. He didn't see which one. He was not Veilithi and could not read the species at that resolution. But someone in the crowd moved, and the crowd opened around that movement, and a Veilithi of adult size came forward very fast, and the child on his arm was not on his arm anymore. He stood there for a second. Lena appeared at his shoulder. She had 2 Veilithi children by the hands and was looking at the square and the crowd and the landing and the reunion and the whole enormous, messy human thing of it with an expression that Tomas did not usually see on her face, which was usually very composed and was currently very not. "You okay?" he said. "I'm fine," she said with the specific tone of someone who was not fine and was keeping that to themselves and had decided that that was okay. "Yeah," he said. "Deshi cried," she said. "Good. He's embarrassed. He shouldn't be." A pause. Around them, the square was resolving into something. Not chaos anymore. Still messy, still loud, still being built in real time, but resolving. The Veilithi civil administration had arrived and was establishing organized reception points. And there were people, Veilithi people, many of them clearly not trained for this, but doing it anyway, moving through the crowd and directing families and processing the children coming off the shuttles with a focus and a purpose that looked very much like a species that had been frightened for a long time, deciding it was done being frightened. More shuttles were coming in. Tomas could see them in the sky. Small dots descending. How many more? Lena said, "I don't know. A lot more. The harvesters still being processed. The intelligence team is still working on the surrender ships. Are we going to find out why they were doing this?" Tomas thought about the warm light in the holding compartment, the calibrated temperature, the soft objects in the children's spaces. "I don't know," he said. "I think so. Eventually." He was right. But eventually it was going to take time and resources and a very particular kind of patience that the fleet did not currently have, because the fleet was in the middle of a rescue operation and a combat after action and a first contact situation with a species they had just defeated and another species they had just rendered a service to, all simultaneously. The intelligence teams would get to the why. The why would turn out to be complicated in the way that terrible things often are, not meaningless, but not clean either, not the simple evil of something that hurt for pleasure, but instead the complicated awfulness of something that had been doing this for 8,000 years for reasons that made a terrible kind of sense in a framework that was not the framework of any civilization that had ever valued the individuals inside it. But that was later. Right now, there are shuttles coming down, and children being found, and a species that had been afraid of humans for 2 centuries, standing in a square in Velisora, receiving their children from the hands of people they had expected to be the monsters. The cost was counted quietly. The fleet's casualty report was filed at 1,400 hours on the day after engagement. EDS Meridian had taken critical reactor damage during the operation to clear a corridor to the boarding target. Of her 412 crew members, 67 had died. 91 were in medical care on the hospital ships. The ship itself was salvageable. 3 other ships had sustained significant damage. Combined casualties across those 3, 41 dead, 112 injured. Total human dead, 108. Mwangi read the report in her quarters, alone, because she had learned over the years that the way she processed casualty reports was not something she was able to do in front of her crew. It was a private thing, not grief in the way that made you stop. She had stopped being capable of that version sometime around her second major engagement, not because she had become callous, but because she had learned the particular discipline of a person who could not afford to be non-functional when other people needed her to be functional. The grief was still there. It went somewhere internal, into a space that had gotten very full over the years, a space she visited and maintained and never left behind. 108 names. She read everyone. She would write to the families. She always wrote to the families. It took a long time. It was the part of command that the training prepared you for least effectively, because no amount of preparation produces a version of a letter to a family that adequately contains what you were trying to say. She would write the letters. She would also write, separately, a report to Earth Defense Command that detailed the gap between what the cooperative's response timeline would have been, 4 to 6 months, and what had happened. She would write it carefully. She would write it with the specific care of someone who was not trying to score points or win an argument, but was trying to ensure that the gap was documented clearly and without dramatic language, so that the people who made resource and policy decisions had the specific numbers in front of them. 108 humans dead in an operation that took 7 days. 261,000 Veilithi children recovered. The cooperative's timeline, 4 to 6 months. She would write that in the report too. She would let the gap speak for itself. The Veilithi Elder Council speaker requested a direct communication with Admiral Mwangi at 1,700 hours on the day of the engagement. Mwangi took the call on the bridge. The channel was clear now. The battle had removed the communications interference that the harvesters had been generating, and the Veilithi relay network had been slowly recovering over the previous 12 hours. The speaker's voice came through the translation matrix with the emotional contextual layers still imperfect but improving. Mwangi could hear more in it now than she had in the first call across 600 light hours of space. Admiral, the speaker said, we have received the latest transport report. The children from the 3rd vessel are being processed now. Yes, Mwangi said. The total number is a pause. The matrix flagged the pause as culturally significant. We did not know there were so many. Our count before the engagement, 247,000, was our best civil record. The actual number, 261,418, Mwangi said. A long pause. Yes, the speaker said. They were being held on 3 separate vessels. We recovered from all 3. Another pause. All of them. All that were on those ships, Mwangi said carefully. We are still working through the data from the surrendered vessels. If there are others, if some were transferred elsewhere before our arrival, we will find that. You believe some may be missing. I believe we don't have complete information yet. I'm not going to tell you something is settled until we know it's settled. The speaker was quiet for a moment. When the voice returned, it had something in it that the translation matrix attempted to render and, settled on, waited. Not quite grief. Not quite relief. something that contained both and was not finished with either. 261,000, the speaker said. And you're dead. 108. Yes. Your people died for our children. Mwangi thought about how to answer that. She thought about what was honest and what was diplomatic and whether those were different things in this specific moment. They died doing what they were asked to do, she said. Which was the mission? You were not asked by us. Not formally. You call, Mwangi said. That was enough. A pause. I have spent 40 years in the council, the speaker said. I have spent much of that time arguing against human expansion, against your presence in systems near ours. I believed another pause. I believed what the cooperative data showed. A species from a death world. A violent history. Military force deployed repeatedly across your own history. We have a violent history, Mwangi agreed. And yet she agreed. I was wrong about what that history meant. I understood the facts and not the context. You built that military history because your world required it. Because surviving requires a different kind of capability than thriving. And you brought that capability here. The voice paused again. I'm trying to find the right way to say what I want to say. I do not have the words. The translation is imperfect. But I want you to know that you don't have to, Mwangi said. I want to. Then say it however it comes. A long pause. Thank you, the speaker said. I have never said that to a human before. I do not think any of my people have. We should have found the occasion before this. I am sorry we did not. Mwangi was quiet for a moment. Take care of your people, she said. That's thanks enough. The channel stayed open another 30 minutes as they moved through logistics and the next phase of the operation. There was still work to do. The surrendered ships, the intelligence processing, the diplomatic implications of what had happened here, the cooperative that was going to have to reckon with the fact that a non-member species in a rapid response fleet had done in 7 days what their entire apparatus had scheduled for 4 to 6 months. There was still work. There was always still work. But in Valeth Sora, in a basement that was no longer a shelter because the reason for sheltering was over, a marine biologist named Ethi sat in the morning light of the city that was waking up for the first time in 18 days and held 3 children and let herself stop transmitting. The relay sat silent beside her. The sky above was clear. Somewhere in that sky, 108 humans were gone. Somewhere in that sky, 261,000 children were being carried home. She held that, and she let herself sit in the particular complicated space of someone who understood what had been paid and what had been received and was not sure how to hold both things, and so she just held them in a morning light with her children's warmth against her side. The universe was a place worth knowing. Today, barely, it was also a place worth being in. 3 weeks after the engagement above Valeth Prime, the intelligence team on the surrendered harvester vessel, designated HSV 01, made the first real breakthrough in translating the ship's data systems. It took 3 weeks because the problem was not merely linguistic. It was not the standard challenge of finding shared reference between 2 language systems. Enough context, enough cross-reference, enough pattern analysis, and any 2 communication systems built on the same physical universe will eventually produce a translation. The challenge with the harvester data was that their communication system was not symbolic in the way that language is symbolic. It was closer to biological encoding, dense, layered, relying on context that was not contained in the signal itself, but assumed to be in the receiver. Lieutenant Commander Femi Ose had spent 14 consecutive days working on it before deciding the problem required a different approach and requesting a full xenolinguistics team from the cooperative database along with an AI language bridge from Earth Defense Command Specialist Division, which was the division that had been built on the hard lessons of 5 prior novel contact situations and was very good at exactly this kind of problem. The AI bridge cracked the first data layer at 0213 on a Wednesday. Ose was awake. He had been awake for 21 hours on the current stretch and was asleep across 2 chairs in the corner of the analysis lab when the alert tone hit his earpiece. He was at the primary display in 4 seconds. The first coherent data cluster that resolved out of the harvester system was a navigational record. Star charts, essentially, movement logs showing the harvester's transit history, formatted in a way that mapped reasonably well to standard galactic cartography once you corrected for their reference frame. Ose pulled the pattern analysis. The clusters lit up. Valeth Prime, current engagement, but also 43 other system markers scattered across the outer ring and into the mid-ring of the galaxy. The movement logs went back a long time. The AI bridge was uncertain about the temporal encoding, flagging it as requiring more calibration. But the early estimate was significant. The harvesters had been moving through inhabited systems for a very long time. 80-year cycles, multiple species, dozens of systems. Osei looked at the map for a long time. Then he pulled the second data layer, which was more difficult, and took another 4 hours of bridge processing, and which turned out to be what the team cautiously described as operational records, the harvester equivalent of mission logs or administrative files. This layer was where the translation got genuinely hard, because it relied most heavily on the biological contextual encoding that resisted direct mapping. But a picture assembled out of it. Incomplete, heavily caveat, marked throughout with translators' uncertainty flags that the AI bridge had inserted every few lines. But a picture. The harvesters were not a single species in the way that term was usually understood. They were more accurately described as an organization, an old one, structured around a purpose that was, in their own encoding, treated as something between a mission and a biological imperative. They were collecting. Specifically, they were collecting young individuals from developing species. Species in what the harvesters' records designated. And this was a translation that made Osei sit very still for a long time, as a stage of cognitive and social development that their records flagged as threshold emergence. They were not taking children as resources, not for labor or sustenance or any of the simple, terrible reasons that something might take children from one civilization for use in another. Their operational records indicated a process that the bridge translated with heavy uncertainty flags as something like preservation. They were taking developing minds from species at critical developmental thresholds, and the next translation was the hardest one, the one Osei brought to Admiral Mwangi personally at 0619 in the morning, standing in her office with the printout in his hands and a specific expression on his face, holding them against an event. Not an event, the records. Explained fully. The harvester encoding around the event was the most biologically dense, the most resistant to direct translation. What the bridge could parse was the shape of it. Something in the future, something on a scale that made the 80-year collection cycles a preparation rather than an end in themselves, something that the harvesters had been working toward for a period of time, that the temporal encoding placed at what might be thousands of years. The children were not a product. They were an insurance policy against something the harvesters had been watching approach for millennia, something they had apparently decided that developing sapient minds from multiple species were uniquely positioned to survive or address or navigate in a way that adult minds of the same species were not. Osei had read the analysis 3 times in the 4 hours between the breakthrough and the briefing. He had come to the same uncertain, uncomfortable, not even close to settled conclusion each time. The harvesters had been doing terrible harm for reasons they believed were protective. Admiral Mwangi read the analysis in full. She sat with it for a while. "Does this change what they did?" she asked. "No," Osei said. "Does it change what we did?" "No," he said again. "Does it change what we need to do next?" He thought about that one. "It complicates it significantly." She nodded. She had known that before he said it. The engagement above Valeth Prime had been, in the operational sense, complete. The harvesters were defeated. The children were recovered. The immediate threat was ended. But the strategic situation had just revealed itself to be substantially more complicated than anyone had understood going in. There was an event on the horizon, unknown in its nature, significant enough that a species had been preparing for it across millennia, and dozens of systems. There were 42 other systems in the Harvester navigational records that the fleet was going to need to share with a cooperative. There were 2 surrendered Harvester ships whose crews were currently in secure containment, and who had not communicated anything beyond "we yield," and who were the only available source of information on whatever was coming. And there were 261,000 Valithi children who were alive and home and would grow up without the full knowledge of what they had almost been held against. What vast and unseen future event had made a species decide that they were worth taking and preserving, that the minds forming in them were something the universe was going to need? Mwangi thought about what to do with all of that. She did what she always did with things too large to hold at once. She broke it into the next concrete problem. "We need to brief the cooperative," she said. "The full intelligence picture. Today. They're going to have questions about our operation here." "Yes." The fleet deployed unilaterally in cooperative adjacent space. "I know. There will be an inquiry." "Almost certainly." She looked at him. "Brief them anyway. Give them everything. And the Veilithi? Give it to them first." She paused. The Elder Council speaker needs to know what we found. Before anyone else, before the cooperative, before any political process, the Ve'alethi need to know what was being done to their children and why, as well as we understand it, as honestly as we can frame it. The translator's uncertainty flags are significant. Then we flag the uncertainty. We tell them what we think we know and what we don't know, and we let them decide what to do with it. We don't sanitize it or manage it or make the decision for them about what they can handle. Osei looked at her for a moment. You trust them with it. I trust anyone with the truth about their own situation, she said. That's the only thing we owe each other. The message to the Ve'alethi Elder Council speaker went out at 0800 hours. Mwangi delivered it herself, over the same frequency they had been using since mid-transit, the one that had been clear and reliable through the whole operation. She read the analysis findings. She read the translator's uncertainty flags. She described the Harvester navigational records. She described the event that the Harvesters appeared to have been preparing against, and the honest limitations of what the fleet currently understood about it. She spoke for 40 minutes. At the end, she said, I don't have good answers yet. I have data and an ongoing translation process and a team of people working the problem. What I can tell you is that your children were not taken for any of the reasons we feared. What I can also tell you is that whatever the Harvesters were afraid of, whatever they were preparing for, the information in those records suggests it may be significant. Not to them, to everyone. She paused. I want you to know that humanity intends to help you understand what they found. And I want you to know that if there is something approaching, whatever it is, humanity intends to help with that too. She let the transmission run for a moment. Not because you asked, because that's what this is now. What it should have always been. The speaker's response came 2 hours later. It was not long. The translation was clear, cleaner now that the Matrix had calibrated on weeks of direct communication. The emotional contextual layers came through without the flattening that had been present in the early calls. Admiral Mwangi, the speaker said, I have called a full session of the council. I will read them your message in full. I will read them the intelligence analysis. I will read them the uncertainty flags. A pause. There is a word in our language that does not translate into standard cooperative common. The bridge attempts it as gratitude that costs you something. It is not the word we use for ordinary thanks. It is the word we use when someone has paid something real, and you understand what they paid, and you cannot make it equal, but you will spend the rest of your life trying. Another pause. I do not have another word for what I want to say to you, so I will use that one. Gratitude that costs you something, for all of you. For the 108. Mwangi sat with that for a while. Then, she called her communications chief and asked what time the cooperative channel was scheduled for. The cooperative inquiry took 4 months. The fleet remained in the Vela system for 2 weeks after the engagement, completing the intelligence work and supporting the Ve'alethi civil administration as it processed what had happened and began the slower work of rebuilding the infrastructure the crisis had disrupted. The hospital ships handled medical support for the children who needed it, a smaller number than feared, but present, because even careful preservation left marks on small things kept too long away from home. When the fleet departed, the Elder Council speaker arranged a transmission from the entire council. All 17 members, speaking sequentially in the Ve'alethi formal mode that the translation matrix had learned to render clearly by then, expressing what they wanted expressed. It was long. It was real. Admiral Mwangi recorded it and kept a copy in her personal archive. The cooperative inquiry concluded that humanity had deployed unilateral military force in a recognized cooperative adjacent zone without formal authorization. This was true. The inquiry also concluded that the response had been necessary, proportionate, and had achieved outcomes the cooperative's own mechanisms could not have achieved in a comparable time frame. This was also true. The two conclusions produced a political tension that the cooperative handled the way the cooperative handled most political tensions, with a committee, a formal resolution, and a set of procedural reforms that would potentially change how emergency response timelines worked in the future. The reforms were not enough. Most people who looked at the numbers said so, including several cooperative member species who had been watching from the sidelines and had been doing their own math on what 4 to 6 months meant against 11 days of ongoing atrocity. The political conversation was going to continue for a long time. On Valeth Prime, 3 months after the engagement, the university in Valeth Sora reopened. It was not a full reopening. The student body was still in recovery, some students choosing not to return, others returning in the specific, carefully forward way of people building back something that had been damaged. But the doors opened, and the lights came on, and the Tidal Garden Institute in the university's Marine Science Wing, which Ethy had helped build 20 years ago, resumed its research program. Ethy was there for the first day. She had given a deposition to the Cooperative Inquiry. She had been interviewed by 14 separate press entities from 12 different species. She had declined most interview requests after the first month, not from bitterness, but from the recognition that she was a person and not a symbol, and that the story that people kept wanting her to be the center of was a story about humans, which was accurate, and not her story to tell. Her story was smaller, more specific, more hers. She went back to the ocean. She went back to studying the deep current ecosystems that she had studied for 15 years, the layered complexity of a biosphere that had been developing for longer than her civilization had existed, the specific patience required to understand something on its own terms rather than yours. She had 3 children who were whole and alive, and who would grow up knowing that something had once moved through the dark to reach them, something from a world that had never been gentle, something that had looked at a distress call in the middle of its own ordinary night and had decided, without deliberation, without process, without committee review, to move. Tavy was 8 now. He had started asking questions about the humans, what they looked like, what their world was like, why they came. Ethy answered what she could, and was honest about what she didn't know, and told him that some questions you had to hold for a long time before the answer became clear. He held them. He was good at that. Lane had started keeping a journal. The entries were short. She was 10 and not yet fully comfortable with the form, but she wrote consistently every day, which was the thing that mattered. The journal was called, in her careful 10-year-old script, Things That Happened and What They Mean, which was an ambitious title for a 10-year-old journal, but which Ethy thought, privately, was one of the best titles she had ever read. Small Sori, who was 5 now, did not ask questions or keep journals. She played with the same focused intensity that 5-year-olds bring to play, which is total, and she slept deeply, and she sometimes pressed her head against Ethy's side in the evenings with the specific contentment of a small animal that is found where it is supposed to be. She did not remember the basement. Ethy did not know if that was a mercy or a loss or both. She had decided it was not hers to resolve. The thing the harvesters had been preparing against, the event on the horizon that their records circled without naming, that their millennia of collection cycles had been responding to in their own terrible way, was still unknown. The intelligence teams were still working. The translation bridge was still developing. 42 systems in the Harvester navigational records were being cross-referenced against cooperative astronomical data to try to build a picture of what had been watched, what had been measured, what had been feared enough to produce 8,000 years of child-taking across dozens of species. The picture was not yet clear. It would become clear. Slowly, the way that pictures built from incomplete data become clear, one confirmed detail at a time, each one shifting the shape of everything around it, the whole thing assembling itself toward an answer that nobody was sure they wanted. But that was a different story. This one ended here, in the Tidal Garden Institute, where Ethy stood at the edge of the observation deck and watched the morning light come off the ocean and thought about the universe. It was a place worth knowing. It was full of things that were hard and things that were beautiful and things that were both at once in proportions that shifted depending on the day and the moment and what you just come through and what you understood now that you hadn't understood before. 108 humans were gone. 261,000 children were alive. Somewhere in deep space, 47 ships were heading toward whatever came next. The ocean moved in its old patterns, layered and patient and indifferent to everything that lived above it, which was not the same as uncaring. The ocean had built the world above it one nutrient cycle at a time, one patient adjustment at a time, one long, unannounced slow movement at a time, the way all deep things work. Ethy stood at the edge of it, and let it be what it was. And in the back of her mind, in the place where the relay had lived for 18 days, where the transmissions had gone out into the dark in the specific faith of someone who believed that someone might be listening, silence. The good kind. The kind that comes after you've said what needed to be said, and it was heard, and something happened, and the story isn't over, but this part of it has completed itself in the only way a part of a story can complete itself, which is not with everything resolved, but with something true. She had called. They had come. The universe was still full of dark, but the dark was finite. She had proof.